and welcome to Donor Dialogue. Each month, we will bring you a conversation with a community leader about the current state of philanthropy, the donor experience, and insights into the donor and volunteer mindset. I'm Lindsay Blok, Senior Vice President of CCS Fundraising, an executive team member serving in Southern California and across the Southwest. CCS has been a strategic partner with nonprofit organizations for more than 70 years, raising funds, planning and implementing fundraising strategies, and impacting the world through philanthropy. After working with nonprofit organizations for 15 years, I'm particularly fascinated by the donor perspective, how our volunteers view nonprofit organizations and philanthropy, and how we can all work together to improve our communities.
Today, my guest is Beth Price. Beth has been involved in a number of organizations in the greater Los Angeles area. Most recently, she has served as the board chair for the Greater Los Angeles Zoo Association, or GLAZA, and currently serves on the executive and audit committees, formerly chairing the development committee. She's also a member of the board of directors of Children's Hospital Los Angeles and serves on the foundation board of trustees for CHLA. She's on the board of the Pasadena Guild of the Children's Hospital. She's also been very involved with her daughter's schools, serving as the president of Claiborne Families Association, the annual fund chair, and on the board of trustees for Flint Ridge Preparatory School. Previously, Beth worked as a litigation attorney at Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy, then as in-house counsel for Intercon Security Systems. She earned her BA from Boston University and her JD from Harvard Law School. She has 2 daughters and resides in South Pasadena. Beth, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that wonderful introduction. I'm not sure. It sounds a lot better than it is. I'm just kind of someone like all of us trying to do what we can. But I appreciate that, and I'm happy to be here today.
So just getting involved, you've been a part of a number of different organizations. How do you think about when to get involved with an organization, how involved you want to be, and which ones you want to work with?
Well, I don't know if my approach was always terribly thoughtful. I think the main thing is a personal connection. And I have to say, kind of as background, I didn't grow up with a real understanding of community philanthropy. My family was solidly middle class to lower middle class. I went to public school. I don't remember my family contributing financially in any way. Certainly, my mom volunteered, a little bit in Girl Scouts and things like that, but it just wasn't a part of my world. And I really didn't get exposed to it till, I was a practicing attorney and I had, a little bit more disposable income. And then my daughters went to private school. And there's a lot of fundraising that goes on in private schools. And that was my first kind of induction into it. And I got involved there because it was a place where my kids went to every day. And I think that motivates a lot of parents. It's about their kids. It's about their education, and you want to do. So that's kind of what got me started with volunteering and philanthropy. Mm-hmm. And then after that, a friend introduced me to GLAZA. She brought me to behind the scenes things with the animals and got me to be a member and then a donor, and then eventually asked me to join the board. And it was mainly, I had more free time. My friend was advocating for it, but I didn't really understand fully the mission of GLAZA or the zoo at the time. It was just, but I did, through the course of working with the organization, did get very connected to the mission. But initially, it was simply a personal connection. And the same is true to some extent with Children's Hospital. My daughter was a patient there. So, I had meetings where they asked me to donate money, and then I hosted an event, and then was asked to join the board. And at that time, I knew a Children's Hospital was a good hospital. I knew children's hospitals in general were a better place for children than adult hospitals. But I didn't really understand the mission that we serve every family, regardless of ability to pay, regardless of whether or not they have insurance. And I didn't really understand the finances of that at all. But being on the board, I got intimately familiar with that, and it made me understand the mission so much better. And again, be so much more committed to the mission and committed as a volunteer and a donor. So, it's mainly some little personal connection, but then certainly being engaged on the board, gets you more committed to the mission of the organization.
Sure. It sounds like you've had some major pivot points in your lifetime as a donor and a potential board member, right? So not growing up with that experience of your family, potentially being very philanthropic or publicly maybe philanthropic. I know my parents did things I had no ideas about. I'm curious from your perspective, if there were some aha moments for you when you first started giving to organizations like to the schools, or when you first joined a board, if you had a real need to flip a mindset or think about things in a new way.
Well, I'm sure I've had several. One, generally the aha moment is to realize how much competition there is for philanthropic dollars and how significant the need is. And with respect to GLAZA, for example, the aha moment was just understanding how important zoos are to conservation efforts at home and around the world, and how, they really are on the forefront of saving wildlife and wild places, and how important that is to the well-being of humans. It's something I never really thought about until I got on the board. And there are lots of aha moments with Children's Hospital, but mainly, being intimately familiar with the revenue and expenses of a nonprofit hospital, and the gaps in our healthcare system. But as far as the donor aha moments, well, I don't know if this is an aha moment, but one thing that I've come to believe is that it's really important to engage donors early on in their life. If you wait until they really have a significant means in their 50s and 60s, they've already got their top 3 nonprofits that they give to. You've really got to reach out to those 30-somethings who may not at the moment have expendable income, but will in the future, and you want to be the first one on their list. So figuring out ways to engage those folks, I think, is really important.
Great. And you've been a board member with several organizations. How has your understanding of being a board member evolved over time?
Because of my legal background, I think I was fairly sophisticated in understanding the role of boards and what they do, their fiduciary obligations, their oversight responsibilities, and how it really is oversight and not running the organization that you're tasked with. I think those things I just immediately understood, I think, because of my legal background. And I think for a lot of board members, that takes a while to really understand if they haven't served on another board before, or if they don't have a certain kind of business or legal background or whatever. So I came kind of knowing the role of boards and how they function pretty early on. The thing that evolved for me over time with being on a board is just a better, more intimate understanding of that particular board, that particular organization's mission. So I think I didn't come to any organization that I served the board on with a real full understanding of that. It was just, there was some personal connection. I had the time. I'd meet new and interesting people, would be engaging, and sure, that's a great organization, but it really didn't really come to intimately understand the mission of any organization until I really served on the board and sat in meetings and met with folks and that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's a great opportunity for people who are looking to get more invested, more involved.
Yeah.
Understanding.
I think find an area that you're somewhat interested in, or that a friend of yours is involved in, and give it a try. I think it's hard. I mean, certainly there are some people who just have a passion for something without having to have a personal connection. But a lot of times you don't know how then to go about getting involved. Certainly not how do I join a board? You really kind of do need to know somebody that's already on the board.
Was it most often, in your experience, a friend, or was it an organization staff member or leader asking you to take a seat on the board or be more involved?
Yeah. Well, I've actually only been on 3 governing boards. I've been on fundraising boards, but only 3 governing boards. And one was because it was my kid's school. And one was a friend. And the final one was, it was the connection with the hospital because my daughter was a patient there. But I did then, host a fundraiser, and somebody on the board who came to that, who I knew was the one that asked me. So I think you do need to know somebody so they know about you to ask you. But the motivation for me in that particular circumstances wasn't the person asking me, it was the organization.
Yeah. You mentioned your, legal profession being helpful in understanding the role of a board. What else have you really brought from that life into the nonprofit sphere? How has that influenced some of your conversations or decisions or your roles with organizations?
Well, one thing, every board I joined, they ask you what committee you want to serve on, and I always picked the audit committee, which most people think that's incredibly boring.
Yeah.
But as a lawyer, a lot of the cases that I worked on was representing lenders and investors suing some accounting firms for bad audits. So I understood things like materiality and risk and internal controls. And so I felt like, well, I have an understanding, so I'll serve on this committee. But something more broadly that I think I took from the legal profession and used in my service as a board member was the importance of process in reaching decisions. Often, you won't always have unanimous agreement with a lot of folks on the ultimate decision. But if you have agreed in advance on a process on how you're going to get there and how you're going to agree on the decision, then if the decision isn't ultimately the way you want it, at least you have some confidence in it because a process was there and a process was followed. So process is a big thing, an important thing for me that I think probably I came to, maybe that's why I decided to be a lawyer, but it's certainly, that's, legal education teaches you the importance of process and procedures and doing all that. So that certainly with respect to GLASA, being in leadership roles there as the development chair and then as the board chair, I really, brought a lot more rigor to our processes. I think only to the betterment there. So, we have term limits that we didn't used to have. We have committees setting work plans for the year that we didn't used to have. We have review processes that we didn't used to have. And I think that makes governing much better, much more understandable. And like I said, even if some folks don't agree with the ultimate decision, they have some comfort in the fact that a process was followed.
Sure. And I'm curious if you would say there's some learnings in the opposite direction. Is there anything that you took from your experience working with nonprofit organizations, whether or not you were on the board, that you applied in other areas of your life?
I've certainly been exposed to different people, different ways of thinking, different backgrounds by serving on boards because, there's a diverse group of people that I'm working with that I would never have, had a chance to meet, to work with before. So I think that's helpful. And I learned from them. I mean, all of our boards have very it's a lot of diversity. I mean, we're working on diversity in general, but certainly there's always been diversity in experiences and background and areas of expertise. So even though I was a lawyer and I worked on audits, I didn't have a lot of financial background. And so certainly being on the board has increased my knowledge in those areas, and working with board members, you know, investment bankers or what have you, that's helped. And just, I think every new person I meet, and I meet a lot being on boards, I think that's one of the things that I value most about serving on nonprofit boards, is just meeting people with different backgrounds and different experiences.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, shifting a little bit to think about just last year in particular, the pandemic really affected us all very differently, and everyone responded a little bit differently, right, to the pandemic. I'm curious how you as a donor viewed giving in 2020. Did you shift your sort of giving strategy? Did you keep things the same? What was the impact?
Certainly, I think as far as the impact of the pandemic on my donating strategy, I think it certainly magnified the importance of it. I think every nonprofit used the phrase, now more than ever. We need your support now more than ever. And I think that resonated with a lot of donors, and they understood that. And I think you started off the question with, it's impacted people differently. Certainly there's been a huge personal toll as far as just not being able to be with people and feeling isolated. But a lot of folks, not all folks certainly, but a lot of folks, especially folks that were already donors to nonprofits, actually did financially pretty well during the pandemic. So their livelihoods were not impacted. Many of them had money in the stock market, and that did well. So many donors, I think, had sufficient financial resources to maintain their giving or increase their giving. And I think many people did that. I certainly did, not to a huge extent, but a little bit, because it was hard not to have an emotional connection to the plight of these various nonprofits. I still primarily supported the two that, you know, Children's Hospital and GLAZA, but there were other organizations. And a friend of mine had a son that was making PPE, and I purchased some of that, donated to the hospital and the Girl Scout, different places. So I think it just made me, and I believe a lot of other donors, feel that it was really time to dig a little deeper and give a little more. You know, certainly there were challenges with the pandemic, that we couldn't be in person. A lot of nonprofits couldn't hold in-person fundraising events. A lot of nonprofits had additional expenses because of the pandemic. So apart from, you know, reaching out to donors and donors feeling more empathic to give, I think there were opportunities to do things differently. And that was one thing that we did at GLAZA right away. And there were lots of circumstances that made this especially successful, but we had our first in-person virtual Beastly Ball. It's our annual fundraiser that usually is very fun at the zoo, with lots of food truck type of things and animal experiences and entertainers and very casual dress. I think it's one of the most successful annual galas in Los Angeles area. We couldn't do that in the pandemic, but we realized that pretty early on. And in May of 2020, we hosted a virtual one. And we netted more money from that than we had in our prior ball, in part because we reached so many more people. Typically, an in-person ball is 800 to 1,000. We were able to get 22,000 viewers on our live stream. And we had relatively minimal expenses. We did that again in 2021. And again, it was successful, not as quite as successful as the first year. And I think in part that was because people were getting maybe a little burnt out by virtual fundraisers, but still it did quite well. And one thing we learned from that is that as soon as we can, we will go back to in-person balls just because they are so much fun and it's great to see people face to face. But we will always have now a virtual component because it allows it. We had donors from New York, many other states outside. So I think, that was something that we would never have done or thought about. And now it's incorporated into our way of doing business now. A lot more Zoom things. Again, we will do things in person, but we will start to have more of a virtual component. Another thing we did was we had weekly inspirations from our president, and that was photos of the various flora and fauna at the zoo, beautiful photographs. We have amazing photographers with inspirational quotes that we just sent out weekly when people are, all they had for company was their computer. And people really liked that. It really resonated with people. I had many donors say, we really like that. And that's something we're going to continue, not on a weekly basis, but on a monthly basis. So a lot of, we had a lot of opportunities and we were pushed to do things we wouldn't normally do, but we learned a lot from doing that. And some of those things we'll keep doing.
Yeah, it sounds like it. As you were talking, my brain was thinking, I wonder if this experience has really provided more openness to thinking about things in new ways, right? So not just a learning from 2020 that we're now going to apply here forward, but from here forward, we're going to be thinking about things differently. So it may not look the same 2021, 2022, and on, but we know we can do things creatively and don't always have to stick to the status quo.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We're more open to trying things in a different way, in a new way. And I will tell you that when the staff is the one that brought this to probably the executive committee initially, they said, because we were toying with, should we postpone it? Other options. And one was to proceed immediately with a virtual one. And a lot of board members were resistant to that. And I was one of them. I didn't see how it worked, but in the end, we trusted our staff and we said, okay, go do it. And they did a fantastic job. So yeah, I learned that you need to be open to trying new things. And maybe they won't always work, but you don't know until you try them.
Very true. Very true. Well, it's been wonderful to chat today and just spend some time talking about all of these great organizations and the work that you've done over the last several years. If you had one piece of advice to give to an executive director, a president, development director, what would that one piece of advice be?
Well, I think the one piece of advice would be, and this is hard to implement, but I think some of your questions kind of got to this. You really do need to figure out a way to engage your donors with the mission. And by engage, I mean really ask them to participate as opposed to passively listen or, even just giving money. I think folks in California are more entrepreneurial and more independent. And I think that's more important to most people in California than having their name on a building. Being involved and giving their 2 cents and participating actively in the mission of the organization. And I also think millennials and Gen Xers, that's really important to them as well. So I think California has always been a bit, but then the younger people coming up, you often see, them starting their own nonprofit instead of joining nonprofits that have a similar mission because they want to be a part of it. And that's a challenge because it's more work for staff. We have a board and we have at GLAZA we have some ambassadors that do influencing for us. We've talked about having other groups of young people and we're working on one to focus on conservation, but it requires more staff time to staff. So you have to be creative in how you can find opportunities for donors to actually kind of come and get their hands dirty without it costing too much in time from the staff. But I think there's ways to do it.
Sure. That's great. Well, thank you again so much, Beth. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Lindsay.